It was early morning when the sun had just started to rise, painting the sky with soft shades of gold. The large house at the end of the quiet street was already awake, even before the neighborhood came to life. Inside that house, a young woman moved quietly from room to room, careful not to disturb anyone. Her name was Lena. She worked as a maid for the family who owned the place. Lena had been working there for almost 2 years. She was known for being gentle, calm, and almost invisible. She didn't speak unless she had to, and she carried out her work with such quiet grace that many people forgot she was even there. Some assumed she didn't speak much English. Others thought she simply preferred silence. But the truth was simple: Lena liked to stay in the background. She had learned in life that people didn't always value what they couldn't see. Every morning she arrived before the family woke up. She would open the curtains slowly, letting the sunlight slip into the rooms. She dusted the shelves, arranged the pillows, and made sure everything was in perfect order. Her movements were soft, almost like she was floating through the house. The family appreciated her work, but they never really tried to know her. They were kind in a distant way, offering polite smiles and short greetings, but nothing more. And Lena didn't mind. Or at least she told herself she didn't. The home she worked in belonged to a man named Mr. Landon, a well-known business owner in the city. He wasn't unkind, but he carried the air of someone who was always busy, always thinking ahead, always moving toward something. His mind seemed full of numbers, schedules, and meetings too full to notice the quiet maid who swept the floors under his feet. His wife, Mrs. Landon, was gentle and polite, but she too lived in a world of social events and charity meetings. Their teenage daughter often rushed out the door with headphones on, barely noticing anyone else. So, for the most part, Lena remained a quiet figure drifting through their daily life. But even though she blended into the background, she watched everything with careful attention. She noticed when someone had a rough morning, when they were stressed, or when they were in a hurry. She knew their habits better than they knew each other's. She knew that. Mr. Landon liked his coffee strong, with 2 teaspoons of sugar. That Mrs. Landon preferred fresh flowers in the dining room. And that their daughter always left her jacket on the sofa no matter how many times she was reminded not to. Lena's life outside of work was small and simple. After finishing her shift, she would return to her tiny apartment, cook herself something light, and sometimes read. She had learned several languages in her childhood because her life had taken her to different countries, but she rarely used those skills now. There was no one to speak to, and no reason to reveal that she understood far more than she let on. On the day everything began to change, the house was preparing for something unusual. There was a heavy sense of importance in the air. The family was expecting an important guest, a business investor, who was flying in from another country. Lena didn't know much about business, but she understood enough to recognize how serious everyone was. Mr. Landon had been preparing for this meeting for weeks. He had talked about it non-stop to his wife, explaining how this deal could change everything for the company. Lena arrived earlier than usual, wanting to make sure the house was spotless. She polished the silver, arranged the chairs, and made sure the meeting room looked perfect. She placed a tray with tea, water, and light snacks near the table. While she worked, she heard Mr. Landon practicing his points for the meeting. Pacing around his study with nervous energy, when the doorbell finally rang, the atmosphere shifted. The investor arrived with 2 assistants, all of them speaking in a language that Lena recognized immediately. She paused for a moment as she carried a tray past the hallway. The words were familiar. For a second, she felt an old part of her wake up, a part she had buried because she no longer needed it. But still, she didn't react. She kept walking with her eyes lowered. Inside the meeting room, the tone of the conversation was polite at first. Mr. Landon welcomed them warmly, tried his best to communicate in English slowly. The investor nodded with a stiff smile, clearly preferring to speak in his own language with his assistants. Lena entered the room quietly to place the tea on the table. No one really looked at her for more than a second. She was just the maid, silent, invisible, and unimportant to them. But as she stepped back toward the door, she couldn't help catching bits of the investor's conversation with his assistants. Their words were not meant for Mr. Landon's ears. They didn't expect him to understand. And they didn't worry about the maid, Assuming she understood nothing, Lena kept her face calm, but her heart slowed. She could understand every word, and what she heard made her uneasy. Still, she stayed quiet. She returned to the kitchen to prepare more refreshments, but her mind was no longer at peace. She knew she shouldn't listen. She knew she shouldn't get involved. Her job was to serve quietly and leave the rest alone. But something about the way the investor spoke bothered her. There was a sharpness in his tone, a hidden message behind his polite smile. The assistants laughed under their breath, exchanging looks that Lena recognized. She had seen that kind of look before in her past one that suggested someone was planning something unfair. As the morning went on, the meeting grew more intense. Lena moved in and out of the room as needed, all while hearing more than anyone realized. Each time she stepped into the room, the investor would pause his private conversation, but only until she left again. They thought she was nothing more than a quiet figure in the background. Someone who couldn't possibly understand them. She wished she didn't. By midday, Lena felt a small ache in her chest. She tried to focus on her work, but her thoughts kept circling around what she had heard. She wasn't sure what she should do. It wasn't her place to speak. She knew her position. She knew the risks. She had worked hard to keep her life steady, simple, and free of trouble. But she also knew the truth. And once you know something, it's hard to unhear it. She wiped the counter slowly, thinking over the words again and again. Part of her hoped she had misunderstood, but she knew she hadn't. The language was one she spoke fluently. The investor didn't just speak carelessly, he spoke with confidence. Certain no one in the room besides his assistants could understand him. In the hallway, she stopped for a moment and took a deep breath. She told herself it wasn't her business. She told herself to stay out of it. People didn't like when others crossed boundaries, but a faint sense of worry tugged at her. Something she couldn't fully ignore. The house that usually felt calm now felt heavy with something she couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the tension she sensed. Maybe it was because she knew the family had no idea what was being said right in front of them. As the meeting continued, Lena stood near the doorway with a tray in her hands, waiting for a signal to enter. She could hear the investor talking again in his language. His tone was sharper now, less polite, more revealing. Lena lowered her eyes, but her mind stayed alert. She knew this was only the beginning, and something inside her whispered that the quiet life she had lived so far might not stay quiet for long, but for the moment. She stayed still, holding the tray tightly, staying silent as always, unaware that this was the first step toward a moment that would change everything. The meeting carried on for longer than anyone expected. By early afternoon, the atmosphere inside the house had shifted. The polite smiles and formal gestures had faded, leaving behind a more strained energy. It wasn't loud or obvious, but Lena could feel it as she moved quietly from the kitchen to the hallway, carrying a fresh tray of refreshments. A heaviness settled in the air, the kind that made her footsteps feel slower and her thoughts sharper. She stood just outside the meeting room, waiting for a good moment to enter. The investor spoke again in his own language, and once more his tone changed the moment he wasn't addressing Mr. Landon. Lena could understand every word, though she kept her eyes lowered and her face still. She never reacted when she heard something unexpected. That habit had become second nature. But today, it grew harder to pretend. The investor was speaking with a smirk in his voice, the kind people used when they believed they held complete control. He whispered something to his assistant, something that would have meant nothing to anyone else in the house. But to Lena, it was clear. He was not here to help the family. He was here to take advantage of them. She felt a small twist in her stomach, the kind she got when something didn't feel right. She reminded herself again that she had no place in this. She was just there to serve tea, clean rooms, and make sure everything stayed in order. That was her job. That was the agreement. Getting involved was never an option. With steady hands, she pushed the door open and walked inside. The investor paused his private conversation instantly, switching back to English with a polite smile. His assistant did the same, straightening his posture as if nothing had happened. Lena placed the tray gently on the table, avoiding eye contact like she always did. Mr. Landon thanked her softly without looking up from the papers in front of him. She nodded and stepped back. Her job done for the moment, but her mind was still occupied by what she had heard. She lingered in the hallway longer than she meant to, trying to sort her thoughts. Something about the situation felt more serious than she first realized. After a few minutes, she returned to the kitchen. She wiped the same counter twice, then 3 times, and realized she was only pretending to clean. She was thinking too much, and she knew it, but she couldn't help it. She had always been observant. Quiet people often noticed what others missed. She didn't hear the investor's voice again until later in the afternoon. The meeting had reached a point where even the assistants seemed restless. Papers lay scattered across the table, and Mr. Landon looked tired but determined. He wanted the deal to work. She could see it in the way he leaned forward, the way he nodded repeatedly, the way he tried to communicate even when the investor made things difficult. At one point, the investor stepped out of the meeting room to take a call. His assistant followed, speaking quickly in their language. Lena was walking past at that exact moment. She moved quietly, her steps barely audible, so they didn't even notice she was there. Their conversation came in sharp, low whispers. They were not discussing the business plan. They were discussing how easy it would be to mislead Mr. Landon. The assistant laughed, making a careless remark about how people who didn't speak their language were easier to trick. The investor agreed, lowering his voice, but not enough. He mentioned details of the contract that didn't match what he had told Mr. Landon. He described hidden terms, small details that could cause serious problems later. It wasn't illegal, but it was deeply unfair. Lena felt a cold wave wash over her. This wasn't just a rude comment or a private joke. This was a deliberate plan to mislead someone who trusted them. She stood completely still behind the corner. They didn't see her. They didn't even notice her shadow. To them, she simply didn't exist. For a moment, Lena closed her eyes. Their words echoed in her mind with painful clarity. She felt something inside her tighten. She knew she couldn't simply pretend she didn't hear it. She knew what this would mean for the family. She knew what it would mean for Mr. Landon's business. But she also knew her own place in the world. No one expected the maid to speak. No one expected her to know anything beyond her chores. If she tried to warn him, would anyone believe her? Would she lose her job for meddling in something that didn't involve her? The fear was real, and she felt it settle in her chest. Still, the truth was now sitting heavy on her conscience. She took a slow breath and walked away from the hallway before they could catch her standing there. She returned to the kitchen and tried to busy herself again. But her hands weren't steady this time, and the towel slipped from her grip. She bent to pick it up, wondering what the right thing to do was. She didn't want to create trouble. She didn't want to lose the job she worked so hard to keep. She didn't want her quiet life to crumble. But once she knew something harmful was happening, it became impossible to act like nothing was wrong. A few minutes later, the meeting resumed. The investor re-entered the room with the same polite mask he had worn all morning. Lena watched him from a distance and felt a new sense of unease. The meeting was reaching its final stage. She could tell by the way Mr. Landon was reviewing the contract with hopeful eyes. He was close to signing it. She stood frozen for a moment. Her heart beat a little faster. She could see how much trust he was placing in the investor. He believed the man was being honest. He believed the deal would help the company grow. There was no way he could know the truth lest someone told him. But who would believe a quiet maid? Lena stepped into the meeting room one last time to clear the empty cups. The investor barely acknowledged her presence, speaking again to his assistant in their shared language. This time, however, Lena caught something that made her chest tighten even further. The investor wasn't just trying to take advantage of the deal. He had no respect for the family at all. He made another comment under his breath, speaking with a casual cruelty that made Lena's hands pause for a moment. It wasn't violent. It wasn't threatening. But it was deeply disrespectful. The kind of remark that showed exactly what he thought of Mr. Landon and everyone in the house. Lena took a slow breath and kept wiping the table, acting as though she hadn't heard a thing. But the words stayed with her long after she stepped outside. By late afternoon, the meeting was nearing its end. The investor suggested taking a short break before finalizing the details. He stepped outside to make another call, leaving his papers behind on the table. His assistants followed, speaking quietly again. Lena stayed in the hallway, gripping the edge of the tray she carried. She felt torn between fear and responsibility. She didn't want to get involved. She also couldn't stay silent anymore. She knew too much. Her thoughts spun as she listened to the low hum of voices from the other side of the wall. The investor's tone was sharper now, filled with impatience. He was clearly confident he would get what he wanted. Lena's hands trembled slightly, but she held the tray tighter and steadied her breathing. She had no idea what she was going to do. She only knew that something inside her refused to stay quiet anymore. Her life had always been defined by silence. It protected her. It kept her invisible. But now, silence felt like a burden she could no longer carry. She walked back toward the kitchen, her mind heavy with the truth she held on to. Every step felt heavier than the last. She knew she was standing at a crossroads. Whichever direction she chose would change everything. For the rest of the afternoon, she moved through the house like a shadow, doing her work, but not really seeing anything. She kept replaying the investor's words in her mind, the hidden terms, the mocking tone, the disrespect. It wasn't just business. It was dishonesty. And even if she tried to convince herself that it wasn't her place, the feeling in her heart wouldn't let her ignore it. As the sun began to set and the evening light spilled through the windows, Lena stood near the meeting room door once again. The investor and Mr. Landon were finishing their final discussion. She could hear the rustling of papers, the scratching of pens, the polite goodbyes waiting to be spoken. Then she heard something that finally pushed her past the point of silence. The investor made another quiet remark to his assistant. Assuming once more that no one else could understand, his tone was dismissive and cold, filled with arrogance. He spoke about how easy it was to manipulate people when they didn't understand his language. Something inside, Lena snapped quietly, not with anger, but with clarity. She could not allow him to walk out of this house with a victory built on lies. She stood still for a moment, gathering the courage she didn't know she had. Her heart pounded heavily, but her mind was sharp with purpose. She knew what she had to do. She just didn't yet know how she would find the strength to do it. But one thing was certain: silence was no longer an option for her. Something was about to change, and deep down, she sensed that the quiet life she'd always lived was standing on the edge of something much bigger. The evening light stretched across the long hallway, soft and warm, but inside Lena's chest, everything felt tense. She stood near the meeting room door with her hands pressed against the tray she held. Though she wasn't sure how long she had been standing there, the voices inside the room grew clearer, and she heard chairs shifting, papers being gathered, and polite words being exchanged. The meeting was ending. The decision was almost made. She knew she didn't have much time. Her heart pounded softly, too softly for anyone to hear, but loud enough that she couldn't focus on anything else. She had never stepped into a situation like this before. She had never interrupted anyone, especially not someone important. She had never spoken up when it wasn't her place. All her life, silence had protected her. But now, silence felt like a lie she didn't want to carry anymore. Her thoughts tangled in her mind as she stood still. She tried to calm herself by taking slow breaths, the way she always did when she felt overwhelmed. But this time, it didn't help. The truth she knew kept pulling her forward, urging her to speak. Inside the meeting room, the investor began speaking again in his own language. There was a relaxed confidence in his tone, almost like he believed everything was already in his hands. His assistant responded with a similar assurance. They didn't think anyone understood them. They didn't even consider the possibility. They spoke about the contract, about how Mr. Landon wouldn't discover the hidden terms until it was too late, about how it would benefit their side far more than it would benefit the family. They mentioned how simple it had been to distract him, and how easy it was to mislead someone who didn't understand their language. Lena closed her eyes briefly. She felt a mix of sadness and disappointment, not anger. She had come to respect the family she worked for, even if she stayed in the background. She didn't want to see them hurt in any way. She didn't want to see anyone misled. A small voice inside her told her that She couldn't let this happen. She stepped forward slowly, her footsteps light but determined. She didn't barge into the room or raise her voice. Instead, she waited at the doorway like she always did, holding the tray in front of her. She waited for a natural moment to enter. Her breath was shaky, but her decision felt firm. When the investor paused to sip his drink, she gently tapped the door with her knuckles. "Excuse me," she said softly. The cook laughed gently. "It's harder when people talk without thinking who can hear." The maid nodded. That was exactly true. The cook leaned closer. "If it's something dangerous, be careful. If it's something unfair, don't let it sit heavy on your heart. You're stronger than you think." The maid didn't feel strong. Not at all. But she appreciated the cook's words. Later that afternoon, the family gathered again, this time in the garden. The maid brought out a tray with tea and small snacks. The air was tense, but people were trying to act calm. She placed the tray on the table and stepped back. The man began talking, explaining his concerns about the family business. He spoke carefully, but some responses were sharp, almost dismissive. One relative accused him of exaggerating. Another insisted he was being paranoid. The maid stood nearby, pretending not to hear. But every word reached her clearly. Then someone made a remark in a foreign language one. The maid happened to understand perfectly. The tone was mocking. The meaning was cruel. And the intention was clear. They didn't think the man deserved respect. The maid felt heat rise in her chest. She didn't usually react like this, but something about the disrespect bothered her deeply. She kept her gaze low, but the man caught her expression. He must have sensed something was wrong because he asked her kindly, "Can you bring another cup of tea?" She nodded and returned to the house. But as she walked away, she heard another whisper in the same foreign language, and it was directed toward her this time. The words were unpleasant, soft enough that most people wouldn't catch them, but she did. She entered the kitchen and stood still for a moment, trying to calm her breathing. She didn't want to react emotionally. She didn't want to get involved. But this was becoming harder than she expected. When she returned with the tea, she placed it in front of the man. He gave her a grateful look, though he still didn't know what she had heard, as she stepped back. One of the relatives said something under their breath in the foreign language again. This time, the maid's eyes lifted before she could stop herself. The relative noticed. "You understood that, didn't you?" the relative said, smirking. The garden grew quiet. The maid froze. Everyone was staring now. She shook her head quickly, trying to avoid attention, but the relative pressed again. "Come now. You understood every word yesterday too, didn't you? Go on, tell us." The maid felt a rush of dread. She didn't want to embarrass anyone. She didn't want to be the reason an argument broke out. But she also didn't want to lie. The man stepped forward slightly, noticing her discomfort. "Leave her alone," he said firmly, but the relative wouldn't stop. If she wants to listen, she should be willing to repeat. The maid stood still, feeling smaller by the second. She didn't want to speak. She didn't want to cause trouble, but she also didn't want to let cruel words slip by without truth. Her hands trembled slightly. Her voice felt stuck in her throat. Then the man said gently, "It's all right. You don't have to say anything. You've done nothing wrong." And for the first time since she started working here, the maid felt someone was truly protecting her, but the relative continued pushing. Looking annoyed by the man's calm defense, "Fine," the relative said. "If she won't repeat it, I will." Since apparently no one here can take a joke, the relative repeated the earlier remark. Louder this time. The rest of the family gasped, but not because of the meaning, because of what the maid did next. She lifted her head fully, looked straight at the relative, spoke clearly, translating the words exactly as they were meant. Her voice didn't shake. She didn't add anything. She didn't soften anything. She simply repeated the truth. The entire garden went silent. The man's eyes widened, not in anger, but in realization. Finally, someone else understood what was really happening, and this moment, this tiny, unexpected act from someone who rarely spoke, was about to change everything the family thought they knew. The garden stayed completely silent after the maid finished translating the words. No one moved. No one spoke. The air felt heavy, almost solid, as if the truth she revealed had changed the shape of the space around them. The maid lowered her eyes again, her hands clasped in front of her. She suddenly felt exposed, as though she had stepped into a bright light when she only meant to stay in the shadows. She wished she could pull back the words, tuck them away, pretend she never said anything. But there was no way to undo the moment. The man looked at her with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. He had known something was wrong earlier, but now he understood more clearly. And he wasn't angry. Not at her. Not even slightly. The relative who made the remarks looked stunned. They kept glancing around as if hoping someone would laugh or defend them. But no one did. Everyone else had heard the words. And now the meaning to another family member finally broke the silence? That was unnecessary, they muttered. Though their voice lacked confidence, the maid felt her chest tighten, but the man stepped forward. No, he said firmly. What was unnecessary was treating people like they can't understand you just because you assume they're beneath you. The relative scoffed. It was a joke. It wasn't funny, the man replied. And it wasn't harmless. The maid watched the exchange quietly. She didn't want to be the center of attention. She didn't want people arguing because of her. She wished they would all forget this happened, so life could return to normal. But she also remembered the cook's words. If something is unfair, don't let it sit heavy on your heart. After a moment, the relatives stormed off toward the house. Clearly upset that people didn't take their side, the rest of the family slowly returned to their seats or walked away quietly, leaving only the maid and the man standing near the table. He turned to her, his voice soft. You didn't expect to speak today, did you? She shook her head quickly. Not even close. He smiled gently. Thank you. Not because you embarrassed anyone, but because you told the truth. Most people here wouldn't dare. The maid wasn't sure how to respond. She simply lowered her eyes and nodded. You didn't do anything wrong, he added. Remember that. His words eased something in her chest. She didn't feel proud of what she had done. But she didn't feel ashamed anymore either. He walked back to the house, leaving her alone in the garden. She stood there for a moment, letting the breeze cool her thoughts before returning to her usual tasks. The rest of the day unfolded quietly. The house felt different. People walked around carefully, as if trying not to bring attention to themselves. Some avoided looking at the maid altogether. Others gave her small, polite smiles they had never offered before. The cook noticed the new tension immediately. When the maid stepped into the kitchen, what happened out there? The cook asked while stirring a pot. The maid shook her head. Nothing good? Did someone say something to you? She hesitated, then nodded, the cook sighed. People forget that their words travel, sometimes farther than they want. The maid didn't want to talk about it anymore, so the cook didn't push. Instead, the cook handed her a warm roll. Eat. You look like you've been holding your breath for an hour. The maid smiled a little and took the bread. Later in the evening, the family gathered for dinner. The maid helped set the table, placing plates and glasses with her usual careful precision. She kept her head down, hoping to avoid any more attention, but it didn't last, as she placed a dish near the center of the table. One of the older relatives cleared their throat. Young lady, they said kindly, may we speak for a moment? The maid froze. Everyone looked at her again. The older relative continued, I want to apologize for what happened earlier. No one working here should be spoken to like that. You deserve respect. The maid's eyes widened slightly. She didn't expect an apology. Not in front of everyone, another family member added. We didn't realize you spoke that language. We should have been more careful. The words held regret, not arrogance. They weren't upset that they had been caught. They were upset with themselves for not treating her well. She bowed her head politely. Thank you, she said quietly. I didn't mean to cause trouble. You didn't, the older relative insisted. If anything, you revealed something we needed to see. The maid stepped back from the table, unsure what else to say. For once, she didn't feel invisible. But she also didn't feel like the center of conflict anymore. The man watched her. From across the table with a gentle expression, as though silently reassuring her that things were improving. After dinner, the maid returned to her usual duties. She collected plates and wiped the table. While cleaning, she heard soft footsteps behind her. It was the man again. "Can I help?" he asked. The maid almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the idea of him helping clean seemed impossible in this house. But he was serious. "You don't need to," she said softly. "I know," he replied, "but I want to." He handed her some folded napkins and helped gather the leftover dishes. They worked in quiet harmony for a few minutes before he spoke again. "You know," he said, "the things you translated, those weren't just insults. They showed me who I can trust in this family." The maid listened carefully. "I've been worried for months," he continued. "I knew someone was working against me in the business, but I couldn't figure out who. Now I understand more clearly." The maid looked at him with surprise. She never imagined her small actions could affect something so big. Everyone turned. Mr. Landon looked up from the papers in front of him, surprised but not bothered. The investor glanced her way briefly, then waved his hand dismissively as if she was only a shadow passing by. Lena stepped inside. "I heard something," she began, her voice quiet but clear. Her fingers trembled slightly against the tray. She swallowed hard and tried again. I think you should know what was said." The investor's eyes snapped toward her sharply, but she kept her gaze lowered out of habit. She didn't want to challenge anyone. She only wanted to tell the truth. Mr. Landon blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" Lena lifted her eyes slowly. It felt strange to meet his gaze directly. She almost never did. "They spoke in their language," she said gently. "I understood everything." Silence filled the room. Thick, sudden, and heavy. The investor stiffened. His assistant shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Landon looked between them, then back at her. "You understood their conversation?" Lena nodded. Her heart raced so hard, she felt lightheaded. "Yes, I speak it. I've known it for years." She felt the investor's glare on her like a weight, but she didn't back down. She kept her tone calm and respectful. "They said things you didn't hear," she said softly. "About the contract. About the terms. There are parts that are not the same as what they told you?" The investor immediately raised his hand to interrupt her, but Mr. Landon lifted his own hand first, something he rarely did. His expression changed from confusion to concern. "Tell me exactly what they said," he said firmly. Lena hesitated for half a second. Her throat tightened, but she spoke anyway. With gentle, careful words, she repeated what she heard earlier, the hidden terms. The misleading explanations, the confidence the investor had in tricking him. She didn't add anything. She didn't exaggerate or accuse. She simply translated the truth. Each word felt heavier than the last by the time she finished. Mr. Landon's expression had shifted completely. His calm professional demeanor was replaced with disbelief, followed by something deeper, a quiet sense of hurt. He turned toward the investor slowly. "Is this true?" he asked. The investor forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "There has been a misunderstanding," he said, switching to English with forced politeness. "She must have misheard, or misinterpreted. These things happen." Lena shook her head gently. "I didn't mishear." The investor's jaw tightened. "You are just a maid," he said sharply. "You don't know business terms?" "You don't understand. I understand the language," Lena said softly, cutting through his words without raising her voice. "And I understand disrespect." Mr. Landon set the contract down slowly on the table. His eyes were no longer confused. They were steady, serious, and sharper than Lena had ever seen. "Please leave the room," he said to the investor, his tone calm but firm. The investor hesitated. His assistant looked nervous. But Mr. Landon didn't repeat himself. His quiet firmness was enough. They gathered their papers quickly and left the room. The door closed behind them with a soft, decisive click. For a moment, the room was silent. Then Mr. Landon turned to Lena. "You understood all of that," he said quietly. Lena nodded. "Yes, and you chose to tell me." She lowered her eyes again. "I didn't want to at first. I was scared. but I didn't think it was right to stay quiet. He let out a slow breath and sat back in his chair. The weight of what he almost agreed to seemed to settle over him. He looked at her with a new expression, one she had never seen from him before. It wasn't the polite acknowledgement he usually gave her. It was something closer to respect. "Thank you," he said softly. "You may have just saved my company." Lena felt oddly shy. She didn't know what to say. She only nodded gently. Her hands still trembled, but there was also a strange sense of relief spreading through her chest. He stood up slowly and walked toward her. "How many languages do you speak?" he asked with genuine curiosity. She hesitated. "3." He raised his eyebrows. "And you never mentioned it?" "It wasn't needed," she said simply. He looked at her for a long moment, as if seeing her for the first time, not as someone passing through the background of his life, but as a person with her own story, her own strengths, her own quiet courage. Before he could respond, the investor opened the door abruptly, clearly frustrated. "This is a mistake," he insisted. "She is lying." "She misunderstood. I think you should leave the property," Mr. Landon said, his voice calm but final. The investor stopped mid-sentence. His face shifted between anger and embarrassment. He wanted to argue, but there was nothing left to say. Lena's words had stripped away every excuse he had. With a frustrated breath, he turned sharply and walked out. His assistant followed, avoiding Lena's gaze as he passed. When the house finally grew quiet again, Mr. Landon turned back to her. "You did something very brave," he said. She shook her head gently. "I just told the truth. Sometimes that is the bravest thing a person can do." Lena looked down, feeling warmth rise in her cheeks. She had never been praised like this before. It felt strange, almost unreal. Before he left the room to make a call, he paused once more and looked back at her. "You shouldn't hide what you know," he said softly. "You're worth more than that." When he walked away, Lena stood alone in the large room, breathing slowly. The evening light still washed over the floor, warm and gentle, and for the first time in a long time, she felt its warmth reach her heart. Her quiet life had always felt small, but at this moment, she realized something new. Even the quietest person could change everything when they finally spoke. And today, she had the next morning began quietly, almost too quietly, as if the house itself was waiting for something to happen. The maid moved through her early tasks with steady hands, but her thoughts were louder than the sounds of her work. She kept replaying the things she heard the day before, the things she never meant to hear, the things she never planned to translate. But once she heard them, there was no going back. She stepped into the hallway with a small basket of fresh towels, her steps soft out of habit. This house was full of secrets, but it was also full of people who pretended nothing was wrong. That contrast always bothered her. She believed silence was useful, not when silence protected things that could hurt others. As she placed the towels on the shelf outside the guest rooms, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps behind her. It was the man whose words she had translated the day before. He was walking slower than usual, as though deep in thought. He greeted her with a small nod. She answered in the same quiet way she always did, but he didn't walk past her this time. Instead, he paused as if wanting to ask something. "You understood more than you said yesterday, didn't you?" he asked. The maid froze for a moment. She never wanted to draw attention to herself, especially not like this. She simply shook her head. But the man gave a half smile that showed he didn't believe her. "It's all right," he said softly. "I'm not angry. If anything, I'm grateful." Those words surprised her. Grateful? For what? She looked at him with confusion, but he didn't explain. Instead, he stepped aside to let her continue. And she returned to her chores, though her mind stayed tangled with questions. By mid-morning, the house was livelier. The family members gathered in the main sitting area to discuss plans for the day. The maid was dusting near the doorway when she heard raised voices inside the room. One of the relatives was discussing a business trip, but the tone was tense. Someone else disagreed sharply. She didn't intend to listen, but the argument grew too loud to ignore. "You're not telling us everything," one person insisted. "I've told you what matters," another replied sharply. The maid's heart beat faster. She recognized the second voice. It was the same man who spoke to her earlier. The same man hiding something that seemed important. She didn't know what it was, but she sensed it carried weight. He stormed out of the room a moment later, frustration on his face. When he noticed her in the hallway, he paused again. He looked as though he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the right words. "Do you think I'm wrong?" he asked suddenly. The maid blinked, startled. She had no idea what he was referring to, and she didn't want to get involved. She shook her head lightly, as if she didn't understand the question. But he saw something in her eyes, something he must have recognized as understanding. He took a slow breath and spoke quietly. "You see things. You hear things. Most people in this house pretend not to notice anything unless it benefits them. But you pay attention. You care?" His voice wasn't accusing or demanding. It carried a kind of tired honesty, the kind people only used when they were sure the listener wouldn't judge before she could respond. Someone else called his name from the other side of the hall. He gave the maid a small nod and walked away. She returned to her work, but the weight of his words followed her from room to room. She didn't want to be involved in their problems, but she also didn't want to ignore something that might bring harm if left unspoken around lunchtime. The maid went to the kitchen to clean dishes left from earlier meals. The cook greeted her with a warm wave, as always. The cook had been in the house for years and understood the rhythm of the family better than anyone. "You look troubled," the cook observed. The maid shook her head at first, but then she sighed softly. She trusted the cook more than anyone else here. Not for gossip, but for wisdom. "It's harder when people talk too much," the maid said quietly. "You didn't cause any trouble," he said. "You revealed the truth. And truth is never trouble." The maid didn't answer, but she felt a calmness settle in her chest. When the kitchen was clean, he thanked her again and went upstairs. As the night grew darker, the maid finished her last tasks. She walked through the quiet hallways, checking the lights and closing the curtains. Everything looked peaceful again. When she finally returned to her small room at the back of the house, she sat on her bed and let out a long breath. For the first time since she started working here, she felt seen not just as someone who cleaned floors or carried trays, but as someone who could make a difference. She didn't want power. She didn't want attention. She didn't want to be in the middle of family disagreements. She just wanted to do her work honestly, and that honesty, somehow, had changed the atmosphere of the entire house. The following morning, the man called her to the study. She entered quietly, unsure why he wanted to see her so early. He offered her a seat, which she politely declined. She preferred standing. "I spoke with everyone last night," he said. "Things will be different now. No one will speak about you the way they did before." The maid nodded. Grateful, and more importantly, he added, "I want to give you something." She looked up. Startled, he reached into a drawer and pulled out a small envelope. "It's not money," he said quickly. Knowing she disliked gifts that felt like payment, "It's something else. Something for your future." The maid hesitated, but took the envelope carefully. Inside was a letter written in simple handwriting. It was a recommendation, one that could help her find better work, better opportunities, a better life when she was ready. "You deserve chances," he said gently. "Real chances. And when you choose to use that letter, it will open doors for you." The maid felt her eyes sting, though she tried not to show it. No one had ever given her something like this. She bowed deeply, unable to put her gratitude into words. He smiled softly. "You've taught this whole family something important. That kindness should be shown to everyone, not just to the people we consider equals, and that our words matter even when we think no one understands them." The maid left the room quietly, the envelope clutched gently to her chest as she walked down the hall. She realized that the truth she spoke, just a handful of honest words, had changed not only the family, but also the path in front of her. And for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful, not because life suddenly became easy, but because she finally understood that even a quiet voice can change everything when it speaks at the right moment, and she was ready for whatever came next.